So you've seen this slide a lot, but maybe not animated like this. We have Darth Vader here, and then obviously we are at the Low-Code Power Summit. We can use the force to show that. So it started PowerPoint, then Power Apps, right? This is PowerPoint. And so, as I mentioned, I'm Betim Beja. I've been a developer since 2003. I was at high school, basically. And I have been awarded the MVP award in 2022 and also founded my own company. It's a small one. We are two technical developers, basically. Aslan is there. And located in Albania. I also organized the first Albanian Power Platform Summit last year, together with Jordi Montana, creator of Fake XRM Easy, and Christian Fernandez, Spanish MVP. So they both came from Spain to Albania to help me organize this event. So I had to shout out. Obviously, we'll need to thank the sponsors and thank you for participating. It's not over, just starting. just so, what I am going to talk about today, I usually don't like too much slides, and I will just show you the code, basically. So you see the last thing is demo. I will talk about, so there's a quick introduction of what code components are. Obviously, Diana did a wonderful job to explain everything there is to know about the PCF components, but I'm going to go quickly over them for people that weren't in the previous session. And then I'm going to talk about limitations that we face from a developer's point of view. I'm going to do a comparison about the testing capabilities that we have in the platform and the alternatives, right? So test harness compared to these other two, which I will talk in a moment. So what are PCF components, or also known as code components recently? Basically are the way that we have to extend the platform. We can see it as a tool that enables the low-code maker developer collaborate with the pro-code developer, where the pro-code developer can focus on the part that they know how to do best, write the code, and use the frameworks that they are used to. And then the low-code developer can take that packaged component, configure it in the Maker portal in one of those three hosts environments that Diana was showing, so Canvas app or model-driven app or Power Pages, and also their child, the custom pages. We do have a manifest that Diana was showing also. The manifest basically, from my point of view, is telling the platform how the maker can configure our component in the environment, and also it's telling the platform which features we need and we want to use in our component. But my focus is mainly interaction between pro-code developer and the low-code developer, so the stakeholders in the project, more than what we can do with the platform itself, right? So I'm more about enabling collaboration. Obviously, the pro-code part in the component is because we are using TypeScript, or you can also use JavaScript if you like, but the platform is TypeScript first. And then you can use the CSS, HTML, or whatever other language on top. For example, you can use Sass to write your stylings and then have a step there to compile that code. And then obviously you can use any framework, almost any framework that you use in the front end in your component, and you can package the dependencies inside, or you can use React and Fluent UI and use the virtual components so that you don't need to package anything because they are offered by the platform itself. And your components will be a lot more lightweight. Or you can go for a pure JavaScript HTML implementation and use no framework at all, right? I've done that in specific cases for having the maximum performance possible. So which are the official tools that we get from Microsoft? Basically, you have the Maker portal where you can configure your PCF component. You have the pack CLI, and that's the tool that Microsoft gives the pro-code developer to configure and to build the components. On the application lifecycle management side, you have two projects, which are MS Build projects, basically, the PCF project and the CDS project. One is the definition of your component, PCF project, which is just a wrapper to the PCF scripts command, basically, and the pack CLI. And then the other is the CDS project, is basically a MS Build definition of a solution, but it's a little bit more advanced because it can have dependencies with your components and build automatically your component because it checks that it doesn't have the latest data and then packages your component, and it generates a solution that you can import in an environment. And you get basically the Power Platform tools, which includes the pack CLI, but you also have the GitHub Actions of the Power Platform tools or the Azure DevOps package, so that you can automate your pipelines and do this building or importing of solutions in a repeatable manner, right? So you can have it as part of your continuous integration for building and packaging, or continuous delivery for importing it in other environments, right? On the testing side, we are a little bit limited from the official tools. We only have the test harness, which you can just do npm run start on your solution project, on your component project. And as I left that for the last because that is a huge limitation, right? But do we have more limitations? So we do have a lot of limitations. We have the unit testing part. Basically, there is no first-party support to do unit testing of your PCF components. We do have, in theory, something that helps unit test Canvas apps, so the test studio or the test engine on the code side, but currently it doesn't support the code components. The infrastructure is there, so it might support it in the future, but that is more like an integration test because it's running against a live environment instead of isolated unit test. As I mentioned, the test harness is one of the tools that Microsoft offers, but has lots of limitations. And most of those limitations are on the component framework API that is not fully implemented because it would be hard. But we have chosen the hard way, and I will show you later. And it is not that much a collaborative tool, right? Because the test harness can only be run from the developer's machine. So if someone who's not a pure developer wants to do a UI test, so go and play with your component, there is no way you can use this. You can create reference applications in a Canvas app or a model-driven app where you import your solution and you configure your data, but it's still not a perfect solution because it is a lot slower to do that kind of testing. You need to license your user just for testing purposes, and you need a live environment. Obviously, the developer experience is a lot limited compared to other frameworks or solutions. And most of the time, the developer is forced to use the Fiddler autoresponder to speed up the development cycle, basically by replacing their component every time only for themselves so that they don't break anything to other users of the same environment. But it is still not a perfect situation, right? Because we are still limiting ourselves to a single developer experience. And it's really, I mentioned the reference apps for gathering feedback. It's really difficult to actually gather feedback from your stakeholders, especially when they are not a professional developer. But we should make it possible to gather feedback, especially from the non-coders, right? Because professional developers are really good at writing code, but are really bad at understanding the actual business needs or the business requirements. They are too focused on the code, right? Mm-hmm. So we should make it possible to gather feedback from the right stakeholders in our project. And obviously, like most of the time, a professional developer is not a UI UX specialist, like 90% of the time, which means we need to make it possible to gather feedback from a UI designer also in a simple way. But UI designers use different tools than coding, so they don't fully understand what's going on underneath. So we'll need to make it possible to gather feedback from most of our stakeholders. So, as I mentioned it briefly in what I'm going to talk in the agenda, we have the test harness offered by Microsoft, we have Storybook, and we have Jest, right, to write unit tests. For those of you who have never heard of Storybook, probably, it's basically an open source tool that considers itself like a workshop to build your components and to showcase your components. And it's, if you have seen the Fluent UI version 9 documentation, it's basically built with Storybook. So you are using it most of the time, but just haven't seen it properly. I won't go into details of how Storybook works. I'm a documentation first person myself, so every time there is something new, I go and read the documentation, or sorry, every time that I want to implement something that is a little bit complicated, I try not to remember all the details of the API or all the details of what I need, the problem that I need to solve, and I go to the documentation. Obviously, when there is something internal that I created, I try to create the documentation for that so that other people can benefit, and my future self also can benefit from having that knowledge stored properly.
Sorry, can I interrupt you for a minute?
Of course.
Because we got the demand here, so we accounted another room. So if you don't want to sit on the floor, you can go to the other room. And I need to ask you to join the Teams link so other room can stream it.
Okay. Yeah. This link here, or?
No, you can actually go on your Teams.
Just a second.
And if I give you the meeting ID.
Okay. Which one? Long domain. Okay.
And then you need to share screen. That's it.
Yeah, I'm sharing the screen.
Okay. So.
Or from Teams. Yes.
Yeah, Teams.
Yeah.
So if you join the meeting with meeting ID.
So it should be probably here. Come on. I know. Long as an ID.
Yeah. 392.
392. Oops.
134.
134.
060.
060.
388.
3.
388. 388. 5.
lowercase x,
Okay, 5x,
3,
3,
capital Y,
y,
Q,
q, and
lowercase
lowercase f. I'm going to turn off the camera, let their microphone, hopefully they can hear.
Yeah.
Now.
And you can share this.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you.
So, if they have any questions on the other room, is there anyone?
On mute.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start here. So you can go and read about the details of Storybook, basically, but as a comparison, to use the test harness, you need basically the PAC CLI, and you are limited to the developer's machine. You can only test one component at a time. Obviously, you can do more by running multiple windows, but it's not the same experience. You have partial support for datasets in the test harness, and you have lots of missing APIs. Lots. So we have created an open source, and I mentioned it in the it's mentioned in basically the session that we will be using lots of open source tools for this, and I've created most of them with my team, basically. So we've created this component framework-mock library, which helps basically integrate PCF component into Storybook or into Jest, right, to write the tests, so that you get almost zero configuration experience for your test setup or for your story setup. Benefits of Storybook, for example, are that you can publish that Storybook as a static website, so you don't need to have the developer's machine running in start mode or whatever. So with Storybook, basically, npm run Storybook. But you can publish it in an internal portal in your company and then share that link with your stakeholders and ask for their feedback, right? They can play with the component. I will show you in a moment. And you can also test multiple components at the same time, which is not actually possible with the test harness. And by multiple components, I mean you can have different stories of different components, or you can have a story where you are rendering two components at the same time in the same canvas, let's say, drawing canvas. You can also use Jest for doing continuous integration of your unit testing, so that you are a little bit protected from regressions. Otherwise, no testing means no regression protection, right? So you might introduce a regression with a later version of your component and notice it too late, right, when you are in production. And there is a possibility, in a sense, to use JS DOM with Jest, so that you can run those tests in full isolation and in basically without needing a headless browser. Or you can also configure it with Playwright and other testing frameworks. And this is all possible because, as I mentioned, we have created, just a second, we have created this library, component framework-mock, which enables you to host your PCF component by using basically an in-memory implementation of whatever you need from the framework. So it is basically showing you a fully working component, but outside of the Dataverse, right? So outside of Canvas app, model-driven apps, or Power Pages. It is the same component, and your work, in a sense, is focused only on developing your component or writing the test cases, but there is nothing specific to the component framework. You don't need to mock anything about the internals, in a sense. Now, we try to mimic as much as possible the framework, but it's a third-party tool, right? It's not a first-party from Microsoft, which means you get my version of how the framework works. You don't get the real Dataverse implementation, right? We try to stick as much as possible by doing tests, let's say, or reverse engineering, if you want to call it like that, even though it's not actually reverse engineering. Now I will go to the code. Like I said, I don't like much. Let me just check a little bit the chat here. Okay, it's fine. I will go to demo time. And I will start showing you code and how it looks and what these limitations that I was talking about are, right? So first off, I will show you the, let me just refresh this. So this is from the Microsoft samples, the web API control. And this is the test harness, right? So I'm doing like a shame game here. Because if I want to create something, I get this message. Sorry. I get this message that this is not supported in the test harness to create a record. If I want to select a record to delete, I get this other message, the method is not supported, and that method is select objects, basically. If I want to calculate the average, it says you are trying to retrieve multiple records and still not supported. So for this specific component, we have hit roadblocks, right? If we had a need for web API in our component, we wouldn't be able to test or to show it unless we just deploy it in a live environment, dev environment, possibly, don't do it in production, and play with Fiddler autoresponder because you'll need to fix things, right? So you can't get it right the first time. And that's the whole meaning of test-driven development, which I want to show. So what we will be getting to is that same component, but into this other host, which is our storybook. Basically, you can find this published. So if you got the link before and you go to the repository of component-framework-mock, there is also a link for this storybook. Now I am showing you the local implementation, but you also have the published version because the creators of Storybook, it's called Chromatic, a company, they also offer a free service to host your stories on the cloud, basically. But it depends on your need if you want to have security and other features, or if it's an open source component, right? This is mainly open source components that I'm showing you, so I can easily publish them into Chromatic. And we also have a blog post. I forgot to share the link. It's called xrm.al. Albanian XRM is one of the organizations, in a sense, that I am trying to do in Albania for open source communities, and we post blog posts there. And by we, it's like been me up until 2 weeks ago, and then my colleague published the latest blog post, which is how to publish these Chromatic storybooks, let's say, with GitHub Actions, so that you can automate and have the latest version always published. So if I click the create record now, I can see that the component is working as expected, right? It's showing the result. You created a record with some ID. If I do the refresh record count, for example, it's doing a retrieve multiple and counting those records. So I see I created one, and it's one. If I do create another record and I refresh again, I see here that I have the other record. I can also calculate the average value. Now these queries here are basically fetch XML queries that are being transformed into SQL, and there is a JS implementation of a SQL database that is actually running your queries in the same way as the platform would do, and it does have a little bit of information, let's say, adapted to the schema that Dataverse actually does if you go to the TDS endpoint or on-premises database. So it's, we have implemented it in a way so that you can use existing knowledge, right? If you want to do some, create some data yourself, you can go directly to the database and write that data, because you might have a scenario where you need to test, for example, with 1 or 2 records or 0 records. If you have a data set especially, you might need these different kind of configurations, right? And basically we have the creator kit components or PowerCut code components. It is this easy to go from one story to the other. You can link them together. You can compose them. I always put some introduction of what these stories are about. It shouldn't be this easy. In a sense, you should explain a little bit more things. You can also integrate your components into this introduction documentation page, but live components where you can also play with them. So this is like a gold mine for your stakeholders, right? So this is the actual component working as in the same way as you would get it into Canvas app, for example. And you can play with the inputs here. For example, I want to change the language of the component, and I'll choose something else, Spanish, for example. And I don't know if you noticed, but the component changed the language. You can remove the day picker, show the day picker. So in the same way as you can play in a Canvas app with the values that you pass to these configuration parameters, you can do it here. And if you notice an error somewhere with this, and I'll try not to make the same mistake twice because there is a bug there, but I won't show it. So if there is, for example, an issue, let me show you an issue with the translations. For example, Italian language doesn't have the proper translations because it's using the long names for some of the months or some of the days. And you want to share this issue basically with your stakeholders or with your developer or with your, if you have a specific internationalization team that only does translations, you can show it to them. You can copy this, I'll open an in private window, and basically you can just give that link to them in a ticket, like Jira ticket or Azure DevOps task or bug, and they can see immediately the configuration that is broken, right? And they can just click the link and see that component, which is still, it's not just a screenshot, right? It's a fully working component. Now, I have shown you a little bit, let's say, of the why, right? Why we need these things, and let's see a little bit. I'll show you this thing here, which is two instances of the same component, for example, that are bound to different fields, or two instances of the same component that are bound to the same field. So if I play with it here, I can see that it's updating the value on the other component also. And I can also do that selection from the platform side. So there was a script or whatever that updated our value, and I get the updated values from the platform, and the component, I test the component that it's reacting to those changes from the platform, right? And if you also open the DevTools, you will see this is another trick that I do, like a little bit of, it's open source, right? But we need to support our development somehow, so I put a little bit of advertising for the developers to see there in the DevTools. But you can also debug your code if you like from here, because you get the original source. It should be in the preview. And you can also debug it like this, right? So you can step through your code and check all the how many times update view is being called, how many times the init is being called, what values do I get there. Now you can see if I think I need to zoom in a little bit. You can see here, basically, let me just put it in the update view just to check what happens. So the component is pretty simple. So for each of those values, I'm creating a list item, then I'm selecting things here, because I'm updating the selected value of every list item. And if I update it, I get the breakpoint again. So it's basically attached to that, and I'm seeing the original TypeScript code, right? In the same way, we can see that code from unit test perspective. But first, I will just show you what that story definition was. So what you need to do in Storybook is to write a .stories file that explains the stories for your component. And then I've just put a simple description here, the title of the story. I don't have parameters. I only have the is disabled or visible for the component. I've done this trick with a class called the render generator, because I try to integrate as simple as possible the component framework-mock, the library that we created that mimics the real component framework, with Storybook. Now the idea is there is a little bit of setup to do, because a component's definition is TypeScript, and when we execute our code, we are executing JavaScript, right? So we lose all the type information, but I need the information of your properties to understand how should the mocked environment behave, right? So I need to know that you are bound to a string property, so that I can check that you are passing a string value and you get a response appropriate to a string value, right? All these are mocked objects, which means if you have something that doesn't fit your requirements, you can just go there and say, For example, this method, instead of doing whatever you guys have done for the platform, I wanted to just reply every time that the record is missing, for example, if you are doing a retrieve. Or, yeah?
So do you put all the fields for account that you're interested in that?
So yeah, this part, the creating the component framework mock generator class, I've created also a command line interface to help you with this setup, so that basically it reads your manifest, and then it will generate all of this information from your manifest. And it's doing a similar thing that the PCF scripts is doing, but it's writing the flavor of information that I need to mock all your data. It's not generating the inputs, outputs, right? Now the other part is this one, the metadata. So instead of you having to mock basically specific functionalities in the retrieve, create, update, what we did is we gave you this in-memory database of Dataverse, basically, and you are just initializing your metadata. So you are telling the platform that I have a table, which is the account, which the primary ID is account ID, and the primary name attribute is the name, and account ID is of type unique identifier, the name is of type string, I have another field there of type money, revenue. And then you can do it like this for many different stories. So you can basically test your component. What happens if that table does not actually exist, right? If I want to do a retrieve accounts, for example, a multiple, right? And I don't have a table called like that, I will see the platform will say that table does not exist, right? If you define in the metadata that you do have a table like that, then it will respond to your queries in the same way as Dataverse does, right? And it will apply some logic to check the validity of what you are trying to do, right? So if you try to retrieve a non-existing record, but its metadata have been defined, you will get the response that that record does not exist. If you try a non-existent table, it will say the table does not exist. And it's pretty much similar to what you get in Dynamics. And the other parts that you need to define, I don't have initial data, I only have the metadata, so the structure of my data. And then I do this, I initialize the first values that I have for my parameters with this set canvas items. And I tell the platform to execute the init method, right? So this will actually call the, and I will show you in the unit test part. I can show you in the story also, but it's similar. This is executed only at the first, so I have this check not container. So if you haven't defined the container, I will do the initialization. But this gets executed on every re-render of the storybook, which means it's a perfect fit for the updates that I get on update view, right, from the platform. So on every update, I'm checking if I updated the arguments, the is visible and is disabled, because this is a simple component, right? If you check the, and I think I should have it somewhere here. No, okay. If you check the creator kit components, then you will see that there are lots of updates happening in there and connecting what the framework or the platform is telling your values are and what the component thinks its values are, right? And it's integrating both ways. It's as easy as just running This is the npm start. To show these stories, basically, it's as easy as I'm going to go into the other project. So you do npm run storybook, and then it will start that storybook showing all the stories that you have for your components, right? And these are all open source. We have an organization called PCF Stories, where we have gathered all the stories we have written for different components, not only the components that we have created. So I did the run, and it generated in a similar way this. For example, we do have, for example, colorful option set here. Come on. I think Diana mentioned it, right? Because she created the colorful option set. I've also created a storybook for that component where you can play a little bit. So this is the options with the primary configuration, which is a star. Or if you want the other configuration, which is a bank icon, you can see we have a different story where the icon is a bank. You can also put other things here. I don't know which icons are available, so I'll go with star again. And refresh. And you can, not a star, it was favorite star field, okay. And you can see I put another icon here, and I can share that link obviously with my stakeholders if there is any issue. And this is for basically storybook. As I mentioned, writing the stories, it's not the main focus of what I wanted to show. It's mainly the integration, and we do have blog posts on how to set up everything. And everything is open source, so you can actually go into one of these repositories and check your own on your own how it is working. And the other thing is, I promised test-driven development, right? So to do test-driven development, you basically write a piece of code and then write a test that validates that that code is running as expected. Probably the test fails, you update your code, the test is successful, then you write another piece of test, it fails, and then you do that green and red cycle, and you keep improving your documentation basically of your component, right? Because you are adding lots of tests which are validating your requirements, right? It's not test just for the sake of it. Usually tests are focused on your requirements and validate that those are fulfilled, or if you get a bug, then you write a test that replicates that bug, you fix the bug, and you are sure that it won't present itself, at least not in the same form, right? Because you might have missed something else. Then every time that you get a new form of your bug, you write a test, fix it, and then you are protected from regressions for not doing the same mistake again. It doesn't mean you won't do new mistakes, right? So for unit testing, I prefer Jest myself, but you can use any test framework in JavaScript. There is nothing in a sense that is specific in the component framework generator. There is nothing specific to a test framework, right? It's just mocking. It is using Sinon to mock the objects, but that's the only dependency it has, right? And the in-memory database, which is SQL. So I can write a before each, which sets up my context like before in the storybook. So it is creating a mock generator, passing the values, like I have a string property. If I have other types of properties. For example, a lookup. I would see I have a lookup property mock here. Now, if I want to make a mistake in a sense, this has a lot of type inference with TypeScript, so it doesn't actually allow you, right? So if I want to tell it that this is a string property mock and not a lookup property mock, you get the build time exception that I was expecting a lookup property mock, right? These types are not compatible. Just that I'm forced to make you write that line of code because the type information is lost when you are doing the actual run. And so we get this initial setup. We initialize the metadata, basically, because this particular test needs metadata, right? If you don't need metadata, it's a simple control that is not doing data manipulation, but it's only working with that property that you get. You don't need to do the initialize metadata. You just specify your inputs and outputs, and then you play around with your component. As I mentioned, this is important, the set canvas items, because it initializes the value for your properties, the initial value. And then I write my tests, right? Like, for example, I expect the component to render something, and I want that whatever is rendered to match a snapshot, right? So this is every time that I do an update on my component, UI update, and there is I have this test that will tell me your snapshot doesn't match, so that I can evaluate if the update was intentional or I made a mistake. So instead of rendering the UI, it's rendering something else, something broken, right? So if I updated something in the UI, and I can just run that test, and I will see the result says I've written a snapshot and the test was successful, right? If I go and check the snapshots here, I can see what that content was. Obviously, I see the HTML code because it's a unit test, but I can also set up playwright tests and take actual screenshots from my component, how it is rendering at that specific moment in time. I can also test that, for example, in my component, when I click the create account, I expect the message to say, you have created a new account record. So you can see here the result container. I'm expecting it to contain this specific string. If I run the test, it will be successful. Probably not. Why not? Okay, so this is an interesting scenario because since I'm creating the accounts with different IDs every time, my snapshot will be different, right? So maybe I don't need the snapshot testing for this, but so I will comment this and check that the test runs successfully. What I will do is I will update this test and remove this initial metadata. So there is no table basically in my dataverse, on-prem in-memory dataverse. And when I run this, if I tell it to create an account, now this should fail because it is expecting a message saying you created a new account with these values. Instead, we got error with the web API call, the entity account does not exist, right? So I can basically work with this kind of, or with this way of doing the development where I write a test and I can check and validate that it's giving me the right value. Now I can even do one more thing, which is something a little bit difficult to do usually with the tools that we have available, which is I can debug my code like this. I need to close this. So if I click debug in my test scenario, okay. Now I changed my setup from normal Windows setup to Windows Subsystem for Linux, and I haven't configured Node.js properly. So I won't do that right now, but you can actually click the debug here and run through your code in the same way as we were doing with the storybook, where we put a breakpoint and we can check the values. With unit testing, you can also publish this test suite in a continuous integration and then gather the test coverage, publish that coverage in your Azure DevOps pipelines, for example, and then you can also make sure that your component is properly tested. So, conscious of time, basically I have to say thank you, and if you have any questions, I would be more than happy to try and answer. Yes?
When you had that mock for the account object,
Yes.
did you have to handcraft the fields, or have you got something that will look at database and give you
So,
image of it you can include?
yes. Basically, that format is the same one that you get if you do get entity metadata from Dataverse. So you can basically copy that from your Dataverse environment, trigger a get entity metadata, copy that value, put it into the mock, initialize metadata. So we tried to make some decisions on our implementation to simplify as much as possible the writing of tests so that you can focus on your code and not on the platform itself. So you don't have to actually manually type everything. You can, for simple scenarios. It's even more advisable to have a limited set of metadata, so you handcraft it. But if you want to test some complicated scenario with multiple tables and with data from multiple tables, you can just take that metadata that way, right, from get entity metadata. Any other question? Yeah.
Are you able to run the client API JavaScript functions inside PCF?
So the
So something like there's a function where you can get all the security logs assigned to the user.
Yes. Now the idea is, in theory, the PCF component should be thought of as in isolation, right? So the client API, the integration between the client API and a PCF component happens through the PCF or the component framework-mock or the component framework API. The idea is that you shouldn't have things that are connected to the client API, the form API, for example, or other external dependencies, because it's not supported, right, to call them directly from your PCF component. But there are ways to integrate. For example, what I usually do, I create an output property of type object, and I call that an event handler, basically. And that would be having the events in model-driven apps or in Canvas apps, because you get a real object there with the whole event arguments. If you want the new events property that Diana was showing before, that would be available only in the Canvas app, where you write the PowerFX, right? I do it with an output property, and I can have the event triggered for both type of host environments. And to do the reverse, so to call from the client API your component, usually you have the parameters, right? So you update your parameters, you call the API that notifies the framework that you have updated the parameters, and you just react. You don't need to do specific integrations, right? Because some things are not supported, unfortunately, right? We should be happy enough that we get the possibility to write our own components with PCF, so that there is almost no requirement that we cannot deliver. But as as Diana was saying before, from Scott Duro, don't write a PCF, right? That really, I was part of that session.
Don't use it.
Yeah, don't use it. Don't use the PCF is really difficult, because basically the platform itself is first-party PCFs. So don't use a third-party PCF, might be better. So do you have any other question, except for who's hungry? Because I think it's...
What's coming next with PCF? You know, is there any major changes that are going to help solve some of these issues?
The things that Diana was showing, basically the modern controls, which means you get the Fluent UI version 9 from the platform itself. And I think, so you'll get that theme parameter with dark mode support and everything else, because since the platform is using PCF components itself for the first party, whatever changes you see in the first party components will eventually come to PCF. Because it makes no sense from Microsoft to basically limit some functionality and keep it only internal. Now, there are some unsupported things that you might see in first-party apps being used, and even in the creator kit components that I was showing, there are some unsupported features, and that's the part where we are being tricked, because we cannot use that because we are out of support, but Microsoft can put themselves out of support, right? They have the internal knowledge, so they can use it because they know when it will break or if it will break.
But sometimes they publish that in the official sample, so you can have a look there.
Yes. So the supported part is if the type is in the component framework API typings, for example, that means it's supported by Microsoft. If it's in the documentation, it is supported by Microsoft. Clearly, if it is specifically stated that it's not supported in the documentation, it means that it's not supported. And I've used things that are not supported because it's the only way, for example, to make it work. For example, if you want the WebAssembly components hosted into your Dataverse, in theory, you shouldn't be able to do it because only JavaScript code is supported as a resource, web resource, but you can also import a WASM file, WebAssembly, by accepting the risk that you are out of support, obviously, right? But the issue is that when we have third-party components, we cannot rewrite 99% of their logic because that might be in WebAssembly. So you are either don't use it, which is the right choice, or take the risk of being out of support and use it. The only issue is that as soon as you face a minor issue with Dynamics and Microsoft sees that you have that unsupported component there, you might not get an answer for your issue, right? Because they will say, first, destroy that unsupported thing there, and then we will, if you still have the issue, then we will help you.
I think that the worst part is they can install an update during the weekend, and on Monday your component won't work. And I think that's the worst part.
Yeah.
Does that ever happen?
Yeah, that's the risk with custom components and third party, right? Because Microsoft is a big corporation, obviously, and doesn't know who we are or what we've done with our environment. So if you don't stick to the rules and supported things, it means most probably they will break your functionality because they don't even know you are there, right?
Talking about the compatibility, is there any plans for like things like Microsoft technologies like Blazor?
Yeah, Blazor is basically WebAssembly.
Is there any plan to incorporate these, for example, in PCFs?
So if you host them externally, there is nothing that says you cannot do it. What was out of support that I was telling about is hosting the WebAssembly file into Dataverse as a web resource. But externally, you can load external dependencies, and it is a supported scenario, basically. You might have content delivery set up and to speed up things. So it's obviously supported, and as long as you stick to the integration between your JavaScript component that is a wrapper to your Blazor component, for example, and the platform, it is supported. Like, there is nothing that says you cannot do things inside your component that don't break functionalities in the host, right? Yeah. So I've done that, and there is nothing in the documentation that says you cannot do it. You can load external dependencies, so it's, from my point of view, and I'm just as any of you here probably, so I'm not a Microsoft employee, so take it with a pinch of salt when I say you can do it, but I've never seen the you are not allowed to do it written somewhere. I think the other people are going to get lunch before us, and we are gonna